There's a morning, later in this story, when I wake up wrapped in sheets that don't belong to me, listening to someone else's heartbeat. And for about an hour, before the sun even finishes rising, I actually believe I found something I wasn't looking for. I promise I'll get you there. But if you're new to this channel, hit that follow button on RP, Forbidden Romances right now. Drop a like on this video and give it a little hype, because it's what keeps these stories coming. My name is Josie Calloway. I'm 24 years old, and until a few months ago, I would have told you my biggest problem was money. I grew up watching my mother stretch every dollar until it screamed, and when I got into Ashcombe University on a scholarship I'd fought for since high school, I thought I'd already survived the hardest part of my life. I was wrong. The hardest part hadn't even introduced herself yet. By the time October rolled around, I was drowning in a Victorian literature course I needed to graduate, taught by a professor everyone on campus talked about in the same hushed, nervous tone. I worked the overnight shift at a diner 2 miles from campus, which meant I got off work at 6 in the morning, showered in 4 minutes flat, and ran to make a 9 o'clock lecture on almost no sleep. My grades were slipping in a way that scared me more than I let on to anyone. I wasn't lazy. I was exhausted, stretched thin between rent and tuition, and a body that was starting to give out on me, running on vending machine coffee and whatever hours I could steal from sleep. But none of that mattered once I stepped through that classroom door, because the woman standing at the front of it didn't deal in excuses. Professor Simone Vaughn was only 38 years old, but she carried herself like someone who'd been born composed, like softness was a language she'd never bothered to learn. She had this way of standing perfectly still at the podium, hands folded, voice low and even, that made an entire lecture hall go quiet before she'd even said a word. Students called her cold behind her back. Some called her worse. I'd heard she'd once failed a senior 3 weeks before graduation over a single missed citation. No discussion, no second chances. 0 exceptions. That was the phrase people used, like it was a warning label. I hated her before I even knew her. The way you can hate a locked door that keeps you from something you need. That particular Tuesday, my shift ran long because the diner got slammed right before close, and I clocked out 40 minutes later than I should have. I sprinted the whole 2 miles in shoes that weren't made for running, my bag banging against my hip, my heart pounding somewhere up in my throat. I stood outside the lecture hall door for a second, catching my breath, feeling that familiar dread pool low in my stomach. I'd been late to her class twice already that semester, and both times she'd looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. I told myself this time would be different. It wasn't. I pushed the door open as quietly as I could, which is never quiet enough in a room that seats over 100 people. The door let out this awful creak that seemed to echo off every wall, and I felt every single head in that hall turn toward me at once. Professor Vaughn stopped mid-sentence, her chalk still resting against the board, and for a moment she just looked at me, saying absolutely nothing. That silence was so much worse than yelling. Professor Vaughn set her chalk down slowly, deliberately. "Miss Calloway," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded like an accusation. "This is the 3rd time this semester." She didn't raise her voice, not even a little, and somehow that made it land harder than shouting ever could have. I opened my mouth to explain about the diner, about the 6 of us covering for 2 people who'd called out sick, and she cut me off before I got a single word out. "Sit down," she said. "We don't have time for excuses today." As if that weren't enough, she glanced down at the roster in her hand and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my last 2 essays had been the weakest in the class. She said it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather, but I felt it land like a slap. I walked to the only open seat in the very front row, of course, and sat down under the weight of everyone's eyes. I pulled my scarf a little tighter around my neck as I sat down. An old habit from growing up in a house that never ran the heat past 60 degrees. I'd worn some kind of turtleneck or scarf on almost every cold morning since I was a teenager, long enough that it didn't feel like a choice anymore, just part of how I got dressed. I just wanted to survive the next 50 minutes without Professor Vaughn looking at me again. That's when it happened. The thing I still can't fully explain, even now. Professor Vaughn had gone back to her lecture, and at some point, her eyes landed on me again, just for a second. I expected more irritation, maybe even disgust. Instead, something crossed her face that didn't match anything she'd said to me minutes earlier, something soft and startled, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Her voice caught, just barely, in the middle of a sentence about a poem I wasn't even listening to anymore. She recovered so quickly that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Outside, the cold air hit my face, and my mind kept circling back to her face in that one unguarded second. There was something about her, something underneath the ice, that felt oddly, impossibly familiar, like a word sitting right on the tip of my tongue that I couldn't quite pull free. I told myself I'd never met a woman like Simone Vaughn in my life, that our worlds didn't exactly overlap. But the feeling followed me all the way back to my dorm. This strange, itching certainty that I'd seen her somewhere before, long before that classroom, long before Ashcombe. I was 24 years old, and Professor Simone Vaughn was, by every account, a stranger to me. And yet I lay awake that night, staring at my ceiling, absolutely certain that somewhere, sometime, our lives had already touched, long before either of us ever walked into that lecture hall. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Replaying that half-second look on her face over and over, and finding nothing but frustrating blankness. By the following Monday, an email arrived from the Dean of Academic Affairs, asking me to come in for a meeting. And I already knew, somehow, that this wasn't going to be good news. I sat across from Dean Whitfield's desk 2 days later, my hands twisted together in my lap, while she explained, gently, that my GPA had slipped below the threshold required to keep my scholarship. She slid a printed sheet across the desk, and I stared at the number at the bottom like it belonged to someone else's life. 2 more classes below a certain grade, and the committee would pull my funding for spring. Without that money, there was no version of this university where I got to stay. I thought about my mother, about the 2 of us doing math at the kitchen table years ago, trying to make a future out of numbers that never quite added up. She said there was still a path forward, mandatory one-on-one academic support with the professor of the course I was struggling in most. When she said Professor Vaughn, I actually laughed, one short, disbelieving sound that had nothing to do with humor. Of every professor at Ashcombe, fate had picked the one woman who already looked at me like I was a waste of her time. I walked out with a printed schedule in my hand. Twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 in the afternoon, in her office, for the rest of the semester. I read the paper 3 times on the walk back to my dorm, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating. They stayed exactly the same. That Tuesday, I stood outside her office door for a full minute before I made myself knock. When she finally called out for me to come in, I pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, cedar and old paper, and something faintly floral underneath it. Her office was smaller than I expected, but it felt controlled. Every book squared away, every paper stacked at a perfect right angle. "Let's be clear about how this works," she said, finally looking up, her eyes steady and unreadable. She laid out the terms like she was reading them off a syllabus. Twice weekly sessions, 1 hour each, no lateness tolerated, and every essay revised until it met her standard, not mine. I wanted to tell her that my standard wasn't the problem, that 4 hours of sleep and a diner apron were the problem. But I bit the words back and just nodded instead. I decided right then that I'd get through this by saying as little as humanly possible. She pulled out my last essay, already marked up in dense red ink, and walked me through everything wrong with it line by line. I braced myself for the same clipped dismissal she'd shown me in front of the whole class. Instead, what I got was worse in a different way. She was thorough, precise, and completely fair, pointing out not just my mistakes, but the exact reasoning behind every single one of them. She'd clearly read every word I'd written, closely enough to catch a structural flaw I hadn't even noticed myself. At one point, she leaned forward to underline a sentence, and her shoulder came close enough to mine that I caught a faint, clean scent, something like bergamot and rain. Somewhere in the middle of the second essay, I asked why a particular line of poetry mattered so much to her. She paused, pen hovering above the page, and then said something quiet about how certain writers understood loneliness better than people gave them credit for, her voice dropping just slightly. It sounded like someone telling the truth by accident, and she seemed to realize it half a second after I did. She straightened up almost immediately, sliding the essay back toward me. "That's enough for today," she said, and her voice had gone completely back to its usual guarded register, like a door swinging shut. When I glanced up to say a quick goodbye, she was already watching me, and neither of us looked away right away, the silence stretching a beat too long to be nothing. Thursday came faster than I expected, and slower than I dreaded, both at once. I'd decided on something almost reckless for me. I wasn't going to sit there and shrink into myself the way I had on Tuesday. We'd been assigned an old Christina Rossetti poem about a woman who keeps something hidden through an entire cold season, wrapping herself in layer after layer while everyone around her guesses at her secret and never quite gets it right. Professor Vaughn slid my paper back with comments clustered around the paragraph where I'd argued the woman wasn't ashamed of her secret at all, just protecting it. "You're reading tenderness into something that's really about restraint," she said, tapping the page. I told her I didn't think restraint and tenderness had to cancel each other out, that maybe she wrapped herself up precisely because she cared so much about whatever she was protecting. Her eyebrows lifted, just slightly. Instead of shutting the idea down, she pushed back, asking whether protection and secrecy weren't sometimes the exact same thing wearing two different names. It turned into an actual conversation, not a lecture. The two of us going back and forth about a 100-year-old poem, like it mattered to both of us personally. Her voice lost some of its usual flatness as she talked, gaining a kind of energy I hadn't heard in either of our sessions so far. I found myself leaning forward slightly, forgetting for a few minutes to be afraid of her. At some point she said something about how the people who hide things best are usually the ones who learned early that honesty didn't keep them safe, and her voice dropped slightly on the last few words, quieter than the rest. I asked if that was something she believed from experience or just from years of teaching literature. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding how much of an answer I actually deserved, then said only that everyone learns that lesson somewhere, one way or another. It wasn't much of an answer, but it felt more honest than anything else she'd said to me all semester. The office felt smaller suddenly, quieter, like the walls had leaned in to listen along with me. Maybe it was that honesty that loosened something in me too, because before I could stop myself, I found myself talking about my own family, about growing up with just my mother after my father left, about the one person in my life who'd always understood me without needing an explanation. I mentioned, almost as an aside, that my older sister lived in England now, had for years, and that some days I missed her so much it felt physical, an actual ache behind my ribs. It wasn't a big confession, nothing dramatic, just the kind of small, true thing you say to someone when a conversation has gotten unexpectedly real. Something shifted the second the words left my mouth. Professor Vaughn went very still, her pen frozen halfway through whatever note she'd been writing, her eyes fixed on some point just past my shoulder. It only lasted a second or two before she blinked and looked back down. But that second felt endless, heavy with something I couldn't name. I remember thinking, absurdly, that she looked almost like someone who'd just heard a name they hadn't expected to hear again. Whatever had passed through her disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the same composed, unreadable expression she wore like armor. Her voice, when she spoke again, had lost every trace of the warmth from a few minutes earlier, gone flat and businesslike. She redirected us back to my essay with brisk efficiency, and I felt the loss of that warmth like a sudden drop in temperature. I ran back through everything I'd said, searching for the offense, and came up with nothing except the mention of my sister, which didn't make any sense as a reason for anything. 2 days after that session, I'd find an email in my inbox extending a deadline I never asked to have extended, unsigned, with no explanation attached to it at all. The anonymous deadline extension sat in my inbox for 2 full days before I let myself open it a second time, like staring at it long enough might reveal who'd actually sent it. There was no name attached, no signature, nothing but a single line from the department's administrative account granting me an extra week on an assignment I hadn't asked to have extended. I told myself it had to be a clerical error, some overworked assistant clearing a backlog without checking names too closely. This was a woman who'd failed a senior 3 weeks before graduation over 1 missed citation. A woman whose entire reputation rested on the phrase 0 exceptions. It felt more likely that the extension was some kind of administrative fluke than an act of quiet kindness from her. By Tuesday's session, she slid my essay back across the desk with a comment in the margins that didn't match her usual clipped, critical tone. Instead of sharp corrections, this note read simply that the observation showed real insight, followed by a suggestion for how I might push the idea further. It was such a small thing, 4 lines of careful blue ink, but it landed somewhere warm and unguarded in my chest, a feeling I wasn't prepared for and didn't entirely trust. Over the sessions that followed, small things kept happening that I couldn't quite explain away as coincidence. A source she recommended appeared, conveniently, already checked out under someone else's account, then mysteriously available again the next morning. A brutal reading assignment got quietly swapped for a shorter one. I started noticing a pattern in the timing. Gestures that always seemed to land exactly when I needed them most. Like someone was watching my exhaustion more closely than I'd ever given her credit for. I started paying closer attention to her too, in ways I hadn't let myself before. I noticed the way her voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever she talked about certain poems, the ones about longing or distance or things left unsaid. She wore the same understated perfume every session, something like rain and bergamot, and I'd started to recognize it before I even stepped fully into her office. That Thursday, our session ran long because I'd finally written an essay she couldn't find much to criticize. When she gathered the pages together to hand back to me, I reached out at the exact same moment to take them from her. Our fingers met somewhere in the middle of that stack of paper, skin against skin for the first time in the 2 months I'd known her, and neither of us moved. It was barely a second, maybe 2, but it stretched out longer than any silence had any right to. I looked up at her without meaning to, and she was already looking back at me, her usual composure slipping just enough for me to see something startled and unguarded underneath it. Her eyes held mine in a way that felt like it was asking a question neither of us knew how to say out loud, something far more complicated than an essay or a grade or a scholarship on the line. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and unsteady. Then, almost in slow motion, I watched something shift behind her eyes, a kind of panic dressed up as composure. She withdrew her hand first, carefully, cleared her throat, and told me, in a voice slightly rougher than usual, that our session was over for the day. When I reached the door and glanced back, she was still standing exactly where I'd left her, staring down at her own hand like it belonged to someone else, like it had betrayed her somehow just by touching mine. Whatever was happening between us had stopped being something I could explain away as imagination or wishful thinking. I only knew that for the first time since I'd walked into her lecture hall soaking wet with dread, I was counting down the days until I saw Simone Vaughn again, and it terrified me more than any bad grade ever had. The days after that almost touch stretched into something I didn't have a name for. I caught her watching me twice more that week, and both times she looked away so fast I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. That Thursday, a storm rolled in off the coast, and by the time I got to Professor Vaughn's office, the sky had already gone the color of a bruise. The storm hit properly around 5, rain slamming against the window, the building's old wiring flickering before settling into a low, warm glow. She lit the small desk lamp she kept for exactly this kind of outage, its light pooling close around us, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. with the power unreliable, we kept working past our usual hour, neither of us suggesting we stop. I asked her, half out of curiosity and half just to fill the strange, charged quiet, whether she'd always loved this particular era of literature. She told me she'd found these poets in boarding school, during a period of her life she described only as very lonely, in a tone that made it clear she'd chosen those two words carefully. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't really an answer, just an admission that she'd spent most of her life being very good at appearing fine, when she wasn't. It was the most honest sentence I'd ever heard her say. She kept talking quietly, about choices she'd made young, about learning early that it was safer to be excellent than to be known, about building a version of herself that nobody could get close enough to disappoint or be disappointed by. I didn't interrupt. At some point I realized I'd leaned forward without noticing, close enough to see the small, unguarded tremor in her hands where they rested on the desk. She mentioned so quietly I almost missed it under the sound of the rain, that she'd loved someone once, a long time ago, and that it hadn't ended the way she'd expected it to end. She didn't offer a name or a single other detail, and something in the set of her jaw told me not to ask for one. Not yet. I felt an ache open up in my chest just watching her. This brilliant, guarded woman who'd apparently spent years building walls so high that even she seemed surprised to find herself talking over one now. Then, almost as if she'd heard my thought, her eyes snapped back into focus, and I watched the walls go up again in real time, faster than I'd ever seen them fall. Her spine straightened. "We should stop for tonight," she said, not meeting my eyes. "The weather's getting worse." At the door, she surprised me by asking if I had an umbrella, if I had somewhere warm to go once I left. It was such a small, ordinary question, but underneath it, I heard something else entirely. Some fragment of the same protectiveness that had been leaving anonymous kindnesses in my path for weeks. I walked out into the rain without an umbrella, barely feeling the cold at all, understanding that I wasn't dealing with a woman who was simply cold by nature. I was dealing with a woman who'd taught herself to be cold as a kind of armor, one she'd worn so long it had started to feel like her actual skin. I didn't sleep well that night, replaying every second of that hour in her office, the storm outside, the lamplight, the way her voice had cracked open just enough to let me glimpse something true. I fell asleep somewhere near dawn, more certain than ever that I wasn't going to let this thing between us die quietly behind her locked office door. The storm night followed me around for days afterward. By Tuesday, I'd made up my mind about something reckless. I wasn't going to let her pretend that hour never happened. She was waiting for me with an almost aggressive kind of composure, her desk cleared of everything except my essay and a single sharpened pencil. Her greeting was clipped, professional, entirely too polished, like she'd rehearsed exactly how many words she was willing to spend on me that day. I recognized what she was doing immediately, because I'd been doing something similar myself for years, building a wall out of efficiency so nobody could see what was actually underneath it. It didn't make me back down. If anything, it made me more certain that something real was hiding behind all that careful control. About 20 minutes in, I set my pen down and asked if she was doing okay after Thursday. She told me it had simply run long because of the weather, nothing more complicated than that. I let her talk for a minute before asking quietly whether professors usually told students about people they'd loved and lost, or if that had been something special to me. Her hand stilled completely, the silence stretching long enough that I could hear the radiator ticking. She told me that what happened during the storm had been unprofessional, a lapse she took full responsibility for, and that it wouldn't happen again. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that it hadn't felt unprofessional to me. It had felt like the first true thing she'd said since I'd met her. She reminded me, in a voice gone tight around the edges, that there were rules about the distance a professor was required to keep from a student. I asked her, before I could talk myself out of it, if those rules were the reason she was pulling back, or if they were just the easiest excuse available to her. "It's easier," she finally admitted, so quietly I almost missed it. to hide behind the rules than to explain why I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. I asked her what exactly she was afraid of. She told me she was afraid of caring about someone the way she used to, of building something only to watch it get taken apart by circumstances neither person could control. I understood, somewhere underneath the ache spreading through my chest, that she wasn't talking only about rules anymore. She was talking about whoever she'd loved before, and maybe, impossibly, about me too. Neither of us said anything for a long moment after that. The office quiet except for our breathing and the faint tick of the radiator against the silence. I felt the pull toward her like gravity, some invisible force drawing me forward in my chair without my permission. And when I glanced at her, I saw the same pull reflected back at me, unmistakable and terrified all at once. Her eyes dropped briefly to my mouth before catching herself, her whole body going rigid like she'd caught herself doing something forbidden. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. She was the one who broke the moment, standing abruptly and moving toward the window, arms wrapped around herself. She said, without turning around, that she needed time to figure out what she was doing, that she wasn't asking me to wait for an answer she didn't have yet. It wasn't a rejection. It was an admission that whatever wall she'd built over the years had a crack running through it now that wasn't closing back up. At the door, I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that whatever she was afraid of, she didn't have to face it as fast as she thought she did. She turned from the window, and for a moment, her eyes held something that looked dangerously close to hope. 3 days passed after that evening in her office, both of us careful and quiet, settled into a strange, charged holding pattern. That Friday, the diner got slammed harder than I'd ever seen it, a burst pipe in the kitchen turning a normal dinner rush into complete chaos, 2 servers calling out sick within an hour of each other. I ended up covering nearly the entire floor alone for almost 6 hours straight, my feet screaming inside shoes that had stopped fitting properly months ago. Somewhere around midnight, a man at table 9 decided my exhaustion was an invitation for cruelty, complaining loudly enough that half the diner turned to look, calling me useless in front of everyone before storming out without paying. My manager sent me home a little after 1 a.m, and I walked outside into air cold enough to sting, my whole body running on fumes, my mind blank in the particular way it gets when you've used up every reserve you had. That's when I saw her, standing near the edge of the quad under one of the old iron lampposts, wrapped in a dark wool coat that looked entirely wrong for 1 a.m. on a Friday. "I called the diner," she said, before I could ask anything, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Someone told me what happened with that customer." I told her I was fine, out of pure habit. She studied me for a long moment, clearly not believing a single word of it. "You don't have to be fine right now," she said softly. "Not with me." Something in my chest simply gave way at that, and before I understood what was happening, I felt tears finally spill over. She didn't hesitate, didn't retreat behind composure the way she usually did the second things got too honest. She closed the last bit of distance between us and pulled me gently against her, one hand coming up to rest against the back of my head. And I let myself lean into her without any of my usual pride getting in the way. Her hand moved slowly against my hair, steady and careful, like she was trying to hold something fragile without breaking it further. When I finally pulled back enough to look at her eyes were shining too, something raw and unguarded moving across her face in the lamplight. She reached up and brushed a tear from my cheek with her thumb, her hand lingering there a moment longer than it needed to. "Josie," she said, my name soft and unguarded in a way it had never sounded from her before. None of the sharpness from that very first lecture hall left in it at all. It sounded like a question and an answer at the same time. I didn't say anything back, just closed the last small distance between us myself, done waiting for whatever fear had been holding her back all this time. Her hand slid gently from my cheek into my hair, and when our lips finally met, it felt less like a beginning, and more like something that had been inevitable since the very first day she'd said my name like an accusation in front of 100 strangers. The kiss was soft at first, careful, like she was giving either of us one last chance to pull away before it became something we couldn't take back. I didn't pull away. If anything, I leaned closer, feeling her heartbeat racing beneath layers of wool and composure. She made a small, quiet sound against my mouth, something between relief and surrender. Time did something strange in that moment. The cold night and the empty quad, and every rule either of us had ever cared about disappearing into the simple, overwhelming fact of her mouth against mine. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing unsteadily in the cold air, she rested her forehead gently against mine, her eyes closed, like she was trying to hold on to whatever had just happened before the world outside that lamplight came rushing back in. For one perfect, suspended second, she looked at me like I was something precious instead of something forbidden. She walked me the rest of the way to my dorm in near silence, her hand finding mine halfway there. At my door, she kissed my forehead softly, told me to sleep well, and I watched her walk away across the quad until she disappeared into the shadows near the faculty building. I went to bed that night happier than I'd been in longer than I could remember, completely unprepared for how quickly the woman who'd kissed me under that lamppost would turn back into a stranger wearing her face. 3 days passed after that kiss, and I spent every single one of them floating somewhere just above my own life, replaying the way she'd said my name like it meant something sacred. Tuesday proved my hope wrong within the first 5 minutes. Professor Vaughn walked into that lecture hall colder than I'd ever seen her, colder even than our very first class together, her eyes sweeping the room without once landing on me. She left the moment class ended, gathering her notes before most students had even packed their bags, disappearing through the side door without a single glance in my direction. The days between that Tuesday and our next scheduled session dragged in a way I hadn't experienced all semester. By Thursday, I'd decided I couldn't sit through another hour of that particular silence without saying something. I walked into her office and asked directly why she was shutting me out again after everything she'd said on Friday. "Because I have to think clearly," she said quietly, "and I can't do that around you." She told me, in a voice stripped of its usual authority, exactly what was at stake. Her tenure review was coming up within the year, and any hint of impropriety with a student, even something as small as rumor without proof, could end a career she'd spent nearly 2 decades building from nothing. She said there were people in her department who'd love an excuse to tear her down, colleagues who resented how quickly she'd risen. It wasn't about regretting what happened between us. It was about understanding, with painful clarity, exactly how much she stood to lose if anyone ever found out. I told her I wasn't asking her to announce anything to the world, only that I couldn't accept her pretending Friday night hadn't happened at all, freezing me out like I'd done something wrong just by responding to her. I asked her, point blank, if she regretted kissing me, needing to hear the actual answer instead of guessing at it through silence and cold lectures. "I don't regret it," she said finally, and something in her voice cracked slightly on the words. "That's the terrifying part." She told me she'd spent years constructing a life specifically built to avoid feeling anything this large, this uncontrollable, and it had happened anyway, despite every precaution she'd taken. She wasn't pulling away because of what she felt. She was pulling away because of how much she felt it, and how little practice she had at surviving something that big without losing herself completely in the process. Neither of us said anything for a while after that, the office settling into a quiet that felt different from our earlier silences, less defensive and more like 2 people finally being honest about being scared. Eventually, it was Vaughn who suggested, carefully, that maybe there was a way to keep seeing each other away from Ashcombe entirely, somewhere private, away from students and colleagues, and anyone who might recognize either of our faces. That Saturday evening, I found myself standing on the front steps of a small house on the quiet edge of town, one I'd never seen before, my heart hammering harder than it had any right to over something as simple as a doorbell. When she opened the door, she looked different somehow, softer, dressed down in a way that made her seem younger than 38, her usual armor left somewhere else entirely. Her home was warm and lived in, full of overflowing bookshelves and a single worn armchair that clearly saw more use than anything else in the room, small details that felt like secrets she was letting me in on just by existing in front of me. We talked for almost an hour over tea neither of us finished, easier with each other than we'd ever managed to be inside her office. And at some point, the conversation gave way to a slow, quiet kiss that felt like relief after days of careful distance. We were still tangled together on her couch when a sharp knock at the front door shattered the moment completely. Both of us froze, her whole body going rigid against mine. She peered through a gap in the curtain and went pale, whispering that it was a colleague from her department. I sat frozen on the couch while she answered the door with a composure that stunned me, her voice perfectly normal. I barely breathed until the footsteps retreated and the door clicked shut again. For a moment after she locked the door, neither of us moved, both of us letting the adrenaline drain slowly out of our bodies in the sudden quiet of her living room. Then, almost simultaneously, we both let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes right after real fear finally loosens its grip. She crossed the room and sat back down beside me, closer than before, her hand finding mine like she needed to confirm I was still actually there. That scare should have been the thing that convinced us both to stop, to walk away while we still had the chance to protect ourselves. Instead, sitting there with her fingers laced through mine and our hearts still racing, I understood we'd already crossed a line neither of us was willing to walk back from, no matter how much smarter that might have been. I left her house well after midnight that night, my whole body still humming from how close we'd come to being discovered. Fear should have made me cautious. Instead, it made everything feel more real, more worth protecting. Like we'd both silently agreed the risk was simply the price of something we weren't willing to give up. The weeks that followed that scare changed something quiet and permanent in both of us. The fear somehow making the time we stole together feel more precious instead of more dangerous. We fell into an unspoken rhythm, careful and deliberate, meeting at her house only after dark, parking my bike 2 streets over just in case. I stopped thinking of it as recklessness and started thinking of it as simply the shape our life together had to take for now. One Saturday evening in early November, she opened her front door before I'd even knocked, like she'd been watching for me from the window, and pulled me inside out of a wind that had turned sharp and biting. The house smelled like rosemary, and something roasting slowly in the oven. Warm and unfamiliar in the best possible way, nothing like the careful, guarded scent of her office. She'd traded her usual tailored blouses for a soft gray sweater with sleeves pushed up past her elbows, her hair loose instead of pinned back. And for a moment, I just stood in her doorway looking at her like she was someone I was meeting for the first time. She caught me staring, and actually laughed. A real, unguarded sound I'd only heard from her a handful of times, telling me to come help her before dinner burned. We cooked together clumsily, bumping shoulders at the stove, her correcting my knife grip with a patience she never showed a classroom of 100 students. We ate at her small kitchen table, candlelight throwing soft shadows across the walls. I found myself talking more than I meant to, about my mother back home, about the tiny apartment we'd shared for years where the heat rarely worked past October, about learning early how to stretch a single grocery bag across an entire week. I told her about watching my mother cry quietly over bills at the kitchen table when she thought I was asleep. I told her, my voice quieter than I meant it to be, about the specific fear that had followed me through every semester at Ashcombe, the constant, exhausting worry that I didn't actually belong there, that someone would eventually realize I'd slipped through some crack I wasn't supposed to fit through. I admitted I'd spent years assuming excellence was the only thing that could ever make up for where I'd come from, that being tired or struggling or simply human wasn't an option available to someone like me. She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on mine in a way that made me feel entirely seen instead of pitied. And when I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, saying quietly that surviving what I'd survived took a particular kind of strength most people never had to find in themselves. After a while, it was her turn to talk, slowly, like she was testing how much weight the moment could hold before it broke. She told me she'd learned, very young, that being loved and being left often arrived as a package deal, and that somewhere along the way, she'd decided it was safer never to need anyone enough to notice the difference. She said she'd built an entire career, an entire identity, around being the kind of person nobody could disappoint because nobody got close enough to try. I asked her gently if it had worked, that plan of hers, and she admitted quietly that it had worked right up until the morning I walked late into her lecture hall. Something about hearing that undid me a little, the idea that I'd cracked something open in her without either of us choosing it. She said, watching me refuse to shrink, refuse to disappear quietly even after she'd humiliated me in front of 100 strangers, had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She'd spent years assuming strength looked like distance, like control, and I'd shown her, without meaning to, that it could look like softness that simply refused to break. We ended up on her couch afterward, dishes abandoned in the sink, her legs tucked under her, my head resting against her shoulder while some old record played low in the background. She traced her thumb along my jaw the way she had that first night under the lamppost. Slower this time, less urgent, like she had all the time in the world instead of stealing borrowed minutes. I asked her if she ever got scared that this might not survive everything stacked against it. She was honest instead of reassuring, admitting that she thought about it constantly, that fear hadn't disappeared just because she'd decided to stop letting it win, but it was no longer strong enough to make her leave. Eventually, she walked me to the door, later than either of us had planned, the November air sharp and clean after the warmth of her kitchen. She kissed me slowly on her doorstep, unhurried in a way that felt like a promise instead of a goodbye, her hands framing my face like she was trying to memorize it. I told her I didn't want to leave, and she admitted, against my mouth, that she didn't want me to either. She asked, almost shyly, if I'd come back the following weekend and stay longer this time, and I said yes before she'd even finished the question. Walking back across the quiet, frost-edged campus that night, I understood that something had shifted between us for good, some final wall coming down that neither of us was interested in rebuilding. The week between that Saturday night and the next felt longer than any week had felt in months, my mind circling back constantly to the warmth of her kitchen, the sound of her laugh, the way she'd asked me to stay longer this time. Even Professor Vaughn's careful, guarded persona in Tuesday's lecture hall couldn't dim the anticipation humming under my skin, because I'd started to understand the difference between that mask and the woman underneath it. When Saturday finally arrived, I spent almost an hour deciding what to wear, which was entirely unlike me, and entirely because of her. She opened the door before I even reached the top step, like she'd been listening for my footsteps on the walk, and the look on her face when she saw me made the whole week of waiting worth it instantly. There was no careful distance in her expression this time, no flicker of professional caution held in reserve. We ended up on her couch again, closer together than we'd ever sat before, a bottle of wine between us that neither of us paid much attention to. There was an ease between us now that hadn't existed even a few weeks earlier, the careful formality of professor and student replaced by something that felt, for the first time, like it might actually have a future. At some point I noticed she'd stopped talking altogether, just watching me with an expression I recognized now, the same one from the lamppost, the same one from her kitchen table weeks earlier. I asked her what she was thinking, more out of habit than genuine uncertainty, because some part of me already knew. She reached up and traced her thumb slowly along my jaw, the way she had that very first night, except there was nothing tentative about it this time. She told me, quietly, that she'd spent weeks being careful, weighing every risk against every possible cost, and that she was tired of doing the math. She said she just wanted, for one night, to stop being afraid of how much she felt. I answered by closing the last small distance between us myself, the way I had that first time under the lamppost. Except this time there was no storm forcing our hand, no fear pushing us together. There was only the two of us, choosing it. The kiss started slow, familiar now in a way that still managed to feel new every single time. But it deepened faster than any kiss we'd shared before. both of us letting go of some final, careful restraint we'd been holding on to. She pulled back only far enough to look at me, her eyes dark and searching in the low light, silently asking a question neither of us needed to say out loud. I answered by taking her hand and standing, pulling her gently up from the couch with me, my heart pounding loud enough that I was certain she could hear it too. She let me lead her down the short hallway toward her bedroom, her fingers laced tightly through mine like she was afraid to let go even for the length of that short walk. At her bedroom door, she paused for just a moment, searching my face one more time, and whatever she found there seemed to settle something in her completely. Her bedroom was simple and warm, lit only by a single lamp on the nightstand that threw soft amber light across the walls. She reached for the top button of my blouse first, her fingers unsteady in a way that felt more intimate than any confidence could have. And I let her, watching her face the entire time instead of looking away. Every layer that came away between us felt like its own small vulnerability offered freely, a kind of trust neither of us had extended to anyone in a very long time. She paused once, her palm resting flat against my collarbone, and told me softly that she wanted to remember every single second of this. In the low lamplight, everything slowed down to something soft and unhurried, her hands mapping gentle warmth against my skin, like she was memorizing something precious instead of simply touching it. I felt her fingers pass briefly over the thin chain at my throat at one point, tracing the delicate metal and the small pendant resting against my collarbone, too caught up in everything else passing between us to give it any real attention. There was a tenderness underneath the desire that surprised me. A kind of gentleness that made the whole evening feel less like something forbidden and more like something we'd both been quietly waiting for our entire lives. What happened between us after that belongs only to the two of us, to that quiet room and that single lamp and the long, unhurried hours neither of us wanted to rush. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the dark, her heartbeat slowing gradually beneath my ear, her fingers still moving in slow, absent circles against my back. At some point she asked, so quietly I almost missed it, if I was okay, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard from her even during the storm or the fear on her doorstep. I told her I was more than okay, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this settled inside my own skin. I fell asleep still wrapped in her arms, certain, for the first time in longer than I could say, that whatever waited for us outside that bedroom door, we'd find some way through it together. I don't know how much time passed before I felt the light change against my closed eyelids, soft and gray at first, then slowly warming into something brighter as morning worked its way past the curtains. I had no idea, lying there in that soft, golden hush before either of us was fully awake, that the very same light creeping steadily across the sheets was about to fall on something I'd kept hidden for years without ever really meaning to. I woke up slowly, the way you only do when nothing is dragging you out of sleep. No alarm, no shift to rush to. Simone's arm was still curled around my waist, her breathing slow and even against the back of my neck, and for a long, suspended moment I didn't move at all, afraid to disturb whatever this was. The room looked different in daylight than it had the night before. Gentler somehow. Sunlight creeping in thin gold lines through a gap in the curtains. A few minutes later, I felt her stir behind me, her breathing changing. A soft, sleepy exhale against my hair. She pressed a slow kiss against my shoulder, and I turned in her arms to face her, both of us smiling in that dazed, unguarded way people only manage early in the morning, before the day has asked anything of them yet. Her hair was mussed against the pillow, none of its usual careful order, and I thought she looked younger like this, softer, more like someone I was allowed to know completely. For a few minutes, we just lay there smiling at each other like idiots, and it was, without question, one of the happiest mornings of my entire life. It was somewhere in the middle of that easy, unhurried quiet that her eyes drifted down and caught on the thin gold chain resting against my collarbone. She reached out and lifted it gently between two fingers, turning it slightly to catch the morning light, studying it with an attention that felt oddly focused for something so small. I didn't think anything of it in that moment. too warm and comfortable to read into a simple glance at a piece of jewelry I'd worn every day for years. "This is beautiful," she said quietly, her thumb brushing lightly over the small pendant, her voice carrying an odd, careful note I didn't recognize yet. Then, almost like an afterthought, light enough that I almost missed the weight underneath it. "I've met someone who wore a necklace very similar to this one." I laughed softly, telling her it probably wasn't that unusual a style, that plenty of people probably owned something similar. She nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on the pendant a moment longer, like she wasn't quite as convinced by her own explanation as she wanted to be. I didn't notice yet how still she'd gone, how careful her voice had become. I was still smiling, still half asleep, still completely unaware that the morning was about to change. "It's actually from my sister," I told her, reaching up to touch the chain myself, warmth spreading through my chest the way it always did whenever I talked about her. I explained that she'd given it to me right before she moved, that it was one of the last things she'd handed me before getting on a plane to a new life I barely understood at the time. I told her, smiling, that I'd worn it almost every single day since, tucked under scarves and turtlenecks most of the year out of some old habit I'd never quite bothered to break. I watched Simone's face as I talked, expecting the same easy warmth I usually got whenever I brought up my sister. Instead, something in her expression had gone very still, very careful, like she was listening to far more than the words I was actually saying. "Your sister?" she repeated slowly, and there was something in the way she said it, some tightness underneath the casual phrasing, that finally made me pause. She asked, almost too carefully, how long ago that had been, when exactly her sister had moved away. I told her it had been years now, since I was a little kid, and watched something flicker behind Simone's eyes that I still couldn't quite name. She sat up a little straighter against the pillows, the easy warmth from a few minutes earlier draining slowly out of her posture. I asked her if everything was okay, a small thread of confusion working its way into my own chest now. She waved the question away too quickly, asking instead, in a voice gone strangely quiet, what my sister's name was. "Claire," I said. "Her name's Claire." The second the word left my mouth, I watched every last bit of color drain out of Simone's face, her whole body going rigid beside me. "Simone," I said carefully, "you're scaring me. What's going on?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the pendant, at me, back at the pendant again. When she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I gave her that necklace," she said. "I bought it for her, a long time ago, before everything ended." The words hit me like cold water, slow at first, then all at once. "You knew Claire," I said slowly, not quite a question anymore. "I loved Claire," Simone said quietly, and something in the plain, unguarded honesty of it made the whole morning collapse in on itself around me. She told me, in short, careful pieces, about a relationship from years earlier, about someone she'd loved young and lost in a way she'd never fully recovered from. Her voice caught as she admitted that some small buried part of her had felt something was wrong from the very first day she'd seen me, a wrongness she'd refused to look at closely enough to name. I sat frozen beside her, memory suddenly rushing backward through years I barely had access to, fragments surfacing from somewhere I hadn't visited in a very long time. A woman's voice reading to me on a couch I could almost picture. A particular warmth. Someone kind who used to visit, who my sister loved fiercely, who disappeared from our lives so completely that I'd grown up with only the faintest, wordless impression that she'd ever existed at all. "I was 6, I whispered, mostly to myself, the pieces finally slamming into place with a force that left me almost breathless. 6 years old, small and half forgotten in the background of a relationship that belonged entirely to the adults around me, too young to understand what I was witnessing, old enough, apparently, to carry some wordless trace of it for the rest of my life. That was it. That was the impossible, itching familiarity that had followed me since the very first day I walked into her lecture hall. I hadn't imagined it after all. Some 6-year-old part of me had recognized her from the very beginning, long before either of us understood what we were looking at. Simone's eyes searched my face, stricken, watching the same realization crash over me that had already crashed over her. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, the warm, golden morning from a few minutes earlier feeling like it belonged to two entirely different people now. Simone was the one who moved first, pulling back slowly, wrapping the sheet around herself. She got out of bed without a word and began dressing with quick, mechanical movements, her hands not quite steady, her eyes fixed anywhere except on me. "Simone," I said, my voice cracking slightly. She paused only once at the doorway, her shoulders rigid with something that looked less like anger and more like grief. "I need to go," she said quietly. And it wasn't cruel, wasn't cold in the way I'd once thought she was capable of, just hollow, like every word cost her something she couldn't afford. She left the room without looking back, and a moment later I heard the front door open and close with a soft, terrible finality that felt louder than any slam could have. I sat alone in her bed in the full light of morning, the sheets still warm beside me, the necklace still caught between my fingers, and felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't have any name for yet. I thought about a woman's voice I could almost remember, about my sister's face years ago, when she used to say a name I'd never once connected to anything real. I sat there a long time after the house went silent around me, staring at the empty doorway, with absolutely no idea how either of us was supposed to survive what we'd just found out. The days that followed felt like walking through a house I used to know, except someone had rearranged all the furniture in the dark. I kept thinking about calling Claire, my thumb hovering over her name in my phone more than once, and every single time I put it down again, because I had no idea what sentence could possibly follow. "Hey, so, funny story." Tuesday's lecture arrived with a dread I hadn't felt since that very first week of the semester. Professor Vaughn walked in wearing an armor I recognized instantly, colder and more complete than anything I'd seen from her even before the Lamppost. She never once looked toward the front row where I sat. Nearly 2 weeks passed like that, both of us performing careful, hollow versions of people who'd never met outside a classroom. My grades actually improved, which felt like its own small, bitter joke, like the universe rewarding me for the exact thing that was breaking my heart. There was one Thursday, close to the middle of that stretch, when our eyes met by accident across her office as I reached for my bag, and something passed between us so fast I almost missed it entirely. It wasn't cold, not in that half second. It looked for just a moment like grief, like longing, like every single thing neither of us had said out loud since that morning the light hit my collarbone wrong. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. The moment passed, and I walked out into the hallway, more certain than ever that whatever had broken between us hadn't actually died. It had just gone very, very quiet. In the nights that followed, I found myself finally sitting still, with the memory I'd spent 2 weeks trying to outrun through sheer exhaustion. I let myself picture our old apartment more clearly than I had in years. The couch with the worn armrest, a record player Claire used to guard like treasure, a woman's laugh drifting in from the kitchen while I sat cross-legged on the floor doing homework I didn't understand yet. I couldn't pull up a face. Not really, just an impression. Warmth and quiet, and the particular way certain adults talk to kids like their opinions actually matter. I understood now why some small, 6-year-old part of me had recognized something in Simone before I ever consciously could have. Some old, buried memory pulling at the edges of a moment neither of us had context for. It didn't undo what happened. It just made the whole strange coincidence of it feel less like fate playing a cruel joke, and more like grief that had simply taken its time finding both of us. The week before Thanksgiving break, our department held its final lecture before the holiday, one of those sessions where half the room is already mentally home with their families. I almost didn't go, some tired, hurting part of me wanting to skip it entirely. But some other part of me, more stubborn, refused to let this be the way things stayed between us. I told myself I'd just watch her, one more time, and figure out afterward if I had the courage to stay behind. She looked tired in a way I hadn't let myself notice from a distance before. Small shadows under her eyes that no amount of careful composure could fully disguise. When the lecture ended, students filed out in the usual noisy rush toward freedom, nobody in any hurry to look back at the woman still standing at the podium. I moved slower than everyone else, gathering my things with deliberate, unhurried care. By the time the last few stragglers cleared the door, it was just the two of us left in that enormous lecture hall. The silence suddenly enormous after the noise of 100 people leaving. I stood slowly and walked toward her, my heart hammering the way it had that very first Tuesday I'd stumbled in late, and terrified. "Simone," I said quietly, and watched her hands go still against her papers. She didn't turn around right away, but she didn't tell me to leave either. "I'm not asking you to erase what you feel about Claire," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I know that's real, and I know it hurt you, and I'm not trying to pretend I understand everything that happened between the two of you." She turned to face me then, her eyes glassy in a way that undid something tight in my own chest. "But what happened with her isn't what's happening between us. I'm not a memory of somebody you lost. I'm not a way back to something that already ended a long time ago." My voice cracked slightly on the last few words. "What we have is ours, Simone. It's new. It doesn't owe anything to the past, and it doesn't have to keep paying for it either." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like she was searching for permission to believe what I'd just said. "I was so afraid," she admitted finally, her voice rough and low, stripped of every ounce of the composure she usually wore like a second skin. "Afraid that loving you meant I never actually let go of her, that somehow I'd just found a way to keep circling the same wound instead of healing it." She reached up and touched my face gently, the way she had that very first night under the lamppost, her thumb tracing along my jaw like she was relearning something she'd been terrified to lose. "But it isn't the same wound," she said quietly. "It never was. I think some part of me knew that the entire time, even when I was running from it. I closed the small distance left between us instead, and when our mouths met this time, there was nothing careful or hesitant left in it, just two people finally choosing each other without any fear standing guard at the door. We stood there a long while afterward, foreheads pressed together in the empty lecture hall, both of us breathing unsteadily. She told me, quietly, that she didn't want to hide anymore. Not completely. Not the way we'd been hiding for months. And that whatever came next, she wanted to face it without pretending we were something smaller than we actually were. I told her I felt exactly the same way, that I was done treating this like something shameful, just because it had been complicated and frightening to arrive at. I walked back across a campus dusted lightly with the season's first snow that evening, warmer than the weather had any right to make me feel. 5 years is long enough to become someone almost unrecognizable to the girl who used to sprint across a frozen campus, terrified of a locked door and the woman standing behind it. On the morning of my wedding, I woke up in a room full of soft, gray light, my hands trembling slightly. Though for the first time in longer than I could remember, it had nothing to do with fear. We hadn't rushed anything after that afternoon in the empty lecture hall, both of us far too aware of what we still had to protect. I finished my degree the following spring, and Simone kept her tenure intact by doing exactly what the rules required, waiting until I was no longer her student in any capacity, before either of us said a word to anyone outside our small, careful circle. There were hard months in between, months of distance and discretion, of dinners at her house with the curtains drawn, of learning patience neither of us had ever been particularly good at. But we never went back to pretending, not once, not after that lecture hall. By the time I walked across the graduation stage, diploma in hand, Simone was sitting in the crowd instead of at the faculty table, and the smile she gave me from those seats told me everything I needed to know about where we were headed. The years after that moved quickly in the way good years tend to, blurring together into something warm instead of dragging the way the hard ones always had. I found work I actually loved, teaching kids not so different from the girl I used to be. Exhausted and stretched thin, but determined anyway. Simone stayed at Ashcombe, eventually stepping into a role mentoring younger faculty, softer now in ways her students probably couldn't fully explain. We moved in together the following year, into a small house not unlike hers, with a kitchen that slowly filled up with cookbooks we both still used badly. I stopped hiding the necklace under scarves and turtlenecks sometime during that first winter, wearing it openly for the first time in over a decade, no longer a habit built out of some nameless instinct to protect something fragile. Simone proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening, which felt exactly right for two people who'd fallen in love inside a strict, unglamorous routine of office hours and essay revisions. She didn't make a big production of it. No crowd, no elaborate surprise, just the two of us in our kitchen. Her hands shaking as she asked if I'd let her love me for the rest of both our lives. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence, the same way I had the very first time she'd asked me to come back and stay longer. We planned a small wedding, intentionally modest, exactly the kind of thing that would have felt impossible to imagine back when we were sneaking around a quiet college town, terrified of a single knock at the door. Neither of us wanted anything grand. We just wanted to stand in front of the people who mattered most, and finally stop being careful. That morning, getting ready in a room full of late autumn light, I could hardly sit still long enough for my mother to finish pinning my hair. She kept telling me to breathe, laughing every time my hands found their way back to the small pendant at my throat, an old habit she recognized even if she didn't know its full history. I caught my own reflection at one point, and barely recognized the calm, steady look on my face, so different from the anxious, sleep-deprived girl who used to run across a frozen quad in shoes that didn't fit anymore. And then, over the sound of guests arriving outside, I heard a familiar voice in the hallway. One I hadn't heard in person in longer than I wanted to admit, asking my mother where she could find the bride. Claire stepped into that room a moment later, and I was on my feet before I'd even fully processed she was real, crossing the space between us in 3 quick steps to pull her into a hug, tight enough to make us both laugh. She'd flown in from England 2 days earlier, insisting on helping with every last detail she could get her hands on, exactly the kind of fierce, protective love I remembered from being small enough to sit on her lap while she braided my hair. She held me back at arm's length after a moment, studying my face with an expression that looked, unmistakably, like pride. There wasn't a trace of tension in her voice when she finally spoke. No hesitation, no old wound hiding underneath politeness. "I always liked her, you know," Claire said simply, her eyes soft. "I'm glad it's you two. I really am." We sat together for a few minutes before anyone else came looking for me, Claire fixing a piece of my hair that didn't actually need fixing, the way she always used to when we were kids. I asked her gently if it had ever felt strange to her, everything that happened. She told me that what she'd had with Simone belonged to a different chapter of both their lives, one that had ended a long time before I ever walked into that lecture hall, and that watching it become something new between the two of us felt less like an old wound reopening and more like something coming full circle in exactly the way it should have. She reached out and touched the pendant at my throat, smiling at some private memory I wasn't part of. "I always hoped this necklace would end up somewhere good," she said quietly. "I just never imagined it would end up here." I didn't have words for how much that meant to me, so I just hugged her again instead, both of us blinking back tears we hadn't planned on shedding before the ceremony even started. The ceremony itself passed in a kind of golden blur, small and intimate, exactly the way we'd both wanted it. I remember the sound of quiet music, the particular warmth of afternoon light slanting through tall windows, and Simone's face when I finally reached the end of the aisle, steady and unguarded in a way that still undid me every single time. We wrote our own vows, and I barely got through mine without my voice breaking, talking about a woman who'd once said my name like an accusation in a crowded lecture hall, and somehow, slowly, patiently, turned it into the softest word I knew. Simone's vows were quieter, simpler, built around a single promise to keep choosing honesty over fear for the rest of our lives together, no matter what either of us had to lose. When we finally kissed as two married women in front of everyone who mattered most to us, I felt something settle permanently into place. Some final piece of the old fear finally laying itself down to rest. At the reception that evening, Claire stood up with a glass in her hand, and the room went quiet in that particular way it does right before something meaningful gets said. She talked about watching her little sister grow into someone brave enough to build a life entirely on her own terms, thousands of miles away from the safety net either of us grew up with. Then, gently, without a trace of discomfort in her voice, she talked about an old chapter of her own life, about loving someone once who'd taught her what real honesty looked like, even when that chapter eventually had to end. She said she couldn't have written a better next chapter for either of them herself, and raised her glass toward the two of us with an easy, genuine smile. The whole room toasted along with her, and across the table, I watched Simone's eyes fill with tears she didn't bother hiding anymore. Whatever ghost either of us had been afraid of for months finally, fully, left the room. What almost nobody at that wedding knew yet, except my mother and Claire, was that we were already carrying a secret of our own, one we'd been saving for exactly the right moment to share. A few months earlier, we'd sat together in a small clinic waiting room, hands linked tightly, choosing a donor with the same careful, deliberate honesty we'd learned to bring to everything else in our life together. I was the one who'd carry our first child, a decision that felt right for reasons neither of us could fully explain, except that Simone had spent so many years afraid of losing the people she loved, and some part of both of us wanted this next chapter to be about building instead of bracing for loss. Late in the reception, once the dance floor had thinned out, I pulled Simone aside and told her what the doctor had confirmed just days earlier, watching her whole face open up with a joy I'd never seen on her before, not even on the morning of our wedding. She pressed her forehead to mine the exact way she had that very first night under the lamppost, years earlier, her hand sliding gently to rest against my stomach, like she was already memorizing something precious. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, just stood there together on the edge of the dance floor, quietly holding the beginning of an entirely new story neither of us had dared to imagine back when we were still hiding from a single knock at the door. Later that night, once most of the guests had gone and the two of us finally sat down together for the first time all day, I thought back to that very first lecture, the girl who'd felt invisible and exhausted and endlessly not enough, certain she'd never belong anywhere that mattered. I thought about every anonymous kindness left quietly in my path, every wall that came down one careful inch at a time. Sitting there in my wedding dress with her hand resting warm over mine, I understood that none of it had been a mistake, not the slow burn of it, not even the hardest parts. Every single piece, even the ones that hurt, had led us honestly to exactly this. I think about that terrified, exhausted girl who used to run across a frozen campus, the one who thought her whole worth depended on never being late, never needing help, never letting anyone close enough to really see her. I wish I could go back and tell her that the coldest person in that lecture hall was about to become the softest place she'd ever land, that the necklace she wore to hide something fragile would one day help her find her way home instead. I wish I could tell her that 5 years from that humiliating Tuesday morning, she'd be standing in a garden full of the people she loved most, married, expecting a child, finally, completely known by someone who'd once seemed impossible to reach. Some love stories start with fireworks. Ours started with a locked door, a cold voice, and a small gold chain neither of us understood the weight of yet. If you followed this story all the way from that very first classroom to this quiet golden ending, thank you for staying with us through every slow, careful step of it. And if you haven't already, follow RP, Forbidden Romances, so you never miss the next story we tell.